By sunrise, Samuel Reed's pasture didn't look like pasture anymore. The creek had gone down during the night, but it had left half the hillside behind. Mud covered the lower field. Fence wire sagged beneath branches and grass. One section of posts had been pushed almost flat, and across nearly 20 acres lay stone. Not gravel stone. Some pieces were small enough to carry in one hand. Others were larger than a feed bucket. Near the creek, several boulders looked too heavy for Samuel's tractor loader. 72-year-old Samuel stood at the gate without saying anything. His neighbor Daniel pulled up 20 minutes later. He climbed out, looked across the field, and whistled. "That's going to take days." Samuel kept looking. Daniel pointed toward the stones. "I can bring the loader over. We push everything into piles, then get a truck in here." "No." Daniel turned. "No, don't move any of it." Daniel looked back at the pasture. "You planning on grazing cattle through that?" "Eventually. Then the rocks have to go." Samuel stepped through the gate. "Not yet." That answer followed him across the field. Daniel came behind. At first the flood damage seemed random. Branches everywhere. Mud in low spots. Grass flattened in different directions. Samuel wasn't inspecting what had been damaged. He was looking at where things had stopped. Near the creek bank he crouched beside a boulder. Fresh mud covered one side. The opposite face had been scraped clean. Samuel looked upstream, then downhill. 30 feet away sat another large stone, then another. Daniel caught up. "What are you doing?" Samuel pointed. "That rock didn't come from here." "How do you know?" "No hole." If the stone had always been in the pasture, the soil beneath it would show an old seat. Instead, it rested on flattened grass and fresh sediment. The flood had carried it there. Samuel walked farther. The largest stones were concentrated near the upper edge of the damaged pasture. Farther out they became smaller. Then came coarse gravel. Dan saw only cleanup. Samuel saw sorting. Moving water could carry material only while it had enough energy. When the water slowed, the heaviest load dropped first, then smaller material. The pasture wasn't simply covered in debris. The flood had recorded where it had been strongest, and where it had begun losing power. Samuel pulled several orange fence flags from his truck. He pushed one beside the first large stone, another beside the second, then a third. Daniel watched. "You marking rocks now?" "I'm marking water." Daniel laughed. Samuel didn't. He continued across the pasture. A fourth flag, a fifth. Then the direction changed. That made him stop. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, but the stones weren't lying parallel to it. Their pattern curved away from the normal channel. Deep into the pasture, Samuel walked ahead without placing another flag. He found flattened grass, a strip of exposed soil. Debris caught against a fence post on the downstream side. Then another concentration of stone. "The water sprayed through here?" Samuel nodded. "Fast." "How fast?" "Fast enough to move that." He pointed toward a stone Daniel couldn't have lifted alone. Samuel continued following the evidence. 200 feet, then 300. The flood path narrowed between slightly higher sections of ground. The grass there had been pressed nearly flat. Samuel crouched and ran his fingers through the mud. A shallow cut had begun forming underneath. Not deep, not yet. Daniel finally understood why Samuel hadn't called the loader. "If we clean this up, we lose the line." Samuel stood some of it. He looked back toward the creek. The flood hadn't thrown thousands of stones randomly across 20 acres. It had carried them along a route, and as the water weakened, it had dropped different material in different places. That route mattered more than the stones themselves. Samuel planted another orange flag, then another. By noon, Daniel could see them from the gate. A curved line of orange markers crossed the pasture. It began where the creek had broken over its bank, but it didn't end there. It continued toward the lowest part of Samuel's property. Daniel followed the flags with his eyes, then looked beyond the last one. His smile disappeared. Samuel was already walking that direction, because if the line continued where the ground suggested it would, the pasture wasn't what the flood had nearly reached. The barn was. Samuel didn't go to the barn, not yet. Daniel followed him back toward the creek, glancing over his shoulder at the orange flags stretching across the pasture. If that water was headed for the barn, shouldn't we start protecting it? Samuel stopped. With what? A berm, a ditch, something. Samuel looked toward the barn. Build in the wrong place and all you do is send the water somewhere worse. Before changing the land, he needed to understand the route the flood had already chosen. He returned to the breach. Here the evidence was violent. Grass had been stripped away. Roots hung exposed from the bank. Mud was packed against fence wire. Several of the largest stones lay just beyond the creek. Samuel set a simple level. Daniel carried the rod into the pasture, one reading, then another, then another. The numbers confirmed what Samuel had suspected. The flood hadn't spread evenly after leaving the creek. It had found a shallow depression, only inches lower than the ground around it. Daniel stood in the middle of it. "I've driven over this spot for years." "So have I. Never saw a ditch." "It isn't a ditch." Samuel looked down the pasture.
"To water, it's enough."
He followed the depression. This time he ignored the stone sizes. Chapter 1 had already told him the flood lost energy as it crossed the field. Now he wanted to know where it had gained energy. 200 feet downstream, the orange flag suddenly narrowed. Samuel stopped. On either side, the ground rose slightly, barely noticeable, but the flood had been squeezed between those higher areas. Daniel pointed toward a shallow cut in the soil. That wasn't there before. Samuel crouched. The dark topsoil was gone. Pale subsoil showed beneath it. He pushed a screwdriver into the cut. The water had stopped behaving like a broad sheet here. It had concentrated, and concentrated water moved faster. Samuel looked upstream, then downstream. That was the dangerous section. Not because it held the most water, because the water had been forced through less space. Daniel finally understood. So next time it cuts deeper. If the next flood uses this route, you think it will? Samuel stood. Gravity hasn't changed, they continued. Then Samuel stopped beside one of the large boulders the flood had deposited. Something behind it caught his attention. The ground immediately downstream was different. Protected. No deep cut. Instead, a small wedge of sand and fine sediment had accumulated behind the stone. Samuel crouched. Daniel joined him. What? Samuel pointed upstream of the boulder. Scoured soil, then downstream deposited sand. Daniel stared at the difference. The rock did that, the water did. Samuel touched the boulder. This changed what the water could do. That was new. Until now, the stones had been evidence. They showed where the flood entered, where it carried the most force, and where it began slowing. But this boulder had done something else. It had interrupted the current. Water struck it, separated around it, lost energy behind it, and dropped material it had been carrying. Samuel stood and looked across the pasture. There were hundreds of stones, some useless where they sat, some dangerous if piled incorrectly. But perhaps some were already doing work. Daniel looked toward the loader parked at the gate. So that's why you didn't want me moving them. Part of why. Samuel still wasn't ready to call the stones a solution. One protected patch of soil didn't mean they should build a wall of rock across the pasture. A wall could back water up, send it around an end, concentrate it somewhere else. Samuel wanted to know what had forced the creek out of its channel in the first place. He walked back toward the breach, then continued upstream. Less than 100 yards later he stopped. A cottonwood had fallen partly across the creek. The trunk itself didn't completely block the channel, but branches had caught everything the flood brought with it. Grass, fence wire, smaller limbs, trash. A thick mass of debris now occupied nearly half the normal opening. Daniel climbed down beside him. There it is. Samuel didn't answer. He studied the opposite bank. The fresh soil was exposed several feet above the normal waterline. The flood had risen behind the obstruction, then attacked the outside bank. Once that bank began failing, more water escaped, and once more water escaped. The shallow depression across Samuel's pasture became a temporary creek. Daniel pointed at the fallen tree. So we remove that, repair the bank, and we're done. Samuel looked at him. Maybe he walked back toward the pasture, this time 20 yards north of the fresh flood path. The grass there was almost untouched. Then Samuel noticed an old fence post. Weathered gray. Probably decades old. About 2 feet above the ground, something remained wedged inside a split in the wood. Samuel pulled it free. Dried grass, old. Packed tight next post. Same height, more debris. Daniel stopped talking. Samuel walked to an old tree farther downhill. On its upstream side was a horizontal scar partly swallowed by years of bark growth. This wasn't from last week's flood. Samuel looked toward the new orange flags. Then at the old debris marks. The lines were disturbingly close. Daniel stared at him. This happened before. Samuel nodded. The fallen cottonwood might explain why the creek escaped this time. It couldn't explain flood debris that had been sitting in an old fence post for years. Samuel looked down the shallow depression they had just measured. Suddenly the problem was much older than one storm. The flood hadn't created a new path across his pasture. It had found an old one. The fallen cottonwood explained the breach. It did not explain the pasture. Samuel stood beside the old fence post, holding the dried grass he'd pulled from a crack 2 feet above the ground. Daniel looked toward the creek. So this flooded before. Samuel nodded. The question now was how far. The newest stones couldn't answer that. They only recorded the last storm. Samuel stopped following them. He followed older evidence instead. At the next fence post, he found another strand of dried vegetation wedged at nearly the same height. Then another. 50 yards farther downhill, the evidence disappeared. Daniel stopped. That's it? Samuel looked at the ground. No, the fence had ended, the water hadn't. He walked toward an old cottonwood standing alone in the pasture. On its upstream side, bark had grown around a horizontal scar. Samuel touched it. Years old. Nearby, several smaller trees showed nothing. That mattered. If wind or livestock had caused the damage, the marks wouldn't consistently face the same direction. Samuel planted a white flag, not orange. Orange marked the recent flood, white would mark the old one. They continued downhill, one scar, one buried branch. A patch of coarse sand beneath several inches of dark soil. Samuel stopped there. He cut a narrow section with a shovel. Daniel crouched beside him. Dark topsoil, then pale sand, then dark soil again. Daniel touched the buried layer. That came from the creek? Don't know. Samuel wasn't going to invent a date, but grass and soil had grown over it. Whatever flood deposited that sand hadn't happened recently. He placed another white flag. By noon, 2 routes crossed the pasture. The orange line showed where last week's water had traveled. The white line reconstructed something older. They weren't identical, but they were close. Both entered the same shallow depression. Both crossed the same narrow section. Then something changed. Orange flags stopped. The recent flood had spread, weakened, and died across the lower pasture. White flags continued. Daniel noticed. That old flood was bigger, or lasted longer. Samuel followed the older evidence, another buried sand deposit, a scar on an old tree, debris trapped inside the remains of a fence line that hadn't been used in decades. Each clue pulled them farther downhill. Toward the barn, Daniel became quieter. Samuel did too. He set the level again. The pasture looked almost flat. It wasn't. Reading after reading revealed a gentle fall through the low ground, only inches at a time. But water didn't need much. Samuel had driven tractors across this field for decades without thinking of it as drainage. Cattle had grazed over it. Grass had hidden it. Normal years had made it invisible. Floodwater saw something else, a root. Daniel looked back toward the creek. So the cottonwood didn't cause this. It caused trouble, but not the root. No, that distinction changed everything. Removing the fallen tree could reduce the immediate obstruction. Repairing the damaged bank could help, but neither would erase the shape of the land. Another flood could escape somewhere else, and once enough water entered the pasture, gravity would offer it the same low path again. Samuel planted another white flag, then stopped. Ahead stood the equipment barn. Daniel looked at the last orange flag, then the white one. The recent flood had stopped well short of the building. The older evidence had not. Samuel walked toward a cottonwood near the barn. At first he saw nothing. Then he moved around to the upstream side. A scar crossed the trunk. Old bark had grown around most of it. Embedded near one edge was a short piece of rusted wire. Samuel touched it. The current fence stood 40 yards away. Daniel stared at the wire. How high? Samuel measured, then looked back across the pasture. White flags now formed a nearly continuous route from the creek to within 60 yards of the barn. Daniel's voice dropped. You think water reached here? Samuel didn't answer immediately. He looked at the barn, then at the ground between them. Something beneath the grass caught his attention. He pushed his boot through the vegetation. Stone, another step, another stone. Not scattered, a line. Samuel crouched and pulled away the grass. The rocks were old, partially buried, and they ran directly across the white flags had just revealed. Daniel stared. The flood put those there? Samuel exposed another stone, then another. He shook his head. No. Someone had known about this water long before either of them started planting flags. Samuel returned to the buried stone line the next morning. He already knew someone had built it. What he didn't know was what they had built it to do. Daniel arrived with a shovel. We uncover the rest, only enough to understand it. Samuel started where the old flood route met the stones. He cleared the grass carefully. The first thing he noticed was height. There wasn't much. Even before decades of soil had accumulated around it, the structure couldn't have stood more than several inches above the surrounding ground. Daniel looked disappointed. That wouldn't stop a flood. Samuel nodded. Exactly. If someone had wanted a wall, they'd built a poor one. Stones weren't stacked high, they were spread wide. Large pieces faced the direction the water would arrive from. Smaller rock filled portions behind them, but gaps remained between sections. Samuel walked 30 feet along the line, then stopped. Looked behind the big ones. Daniel crouched. Dark soil covered most of the ground, but beneath it Samuel exposed a wedge of pale sand. He moved to the next large stone, then another, all on the downstream side. Daniel remembered the boulder from the recent flood. Same thing? Samuel nodded. Water had struck these stones. Lost energy, dropped sediment behind them, not once, repeatedly. Samuel cut a narrow section through the soil, dark earth, sand, dark earth again. Then another thin layer of coarse material. Daniel stared. How many floods? Enough. Samuel wasn't going to invent a number. But the layers proved something important. This structure hadn't simply survived water. It had been positioned where water repeatedly crossed the pasture. They continued. The stone line changed as the ground changed. Where the old flood route narrowed, the stones were larger and spread wider. Where the pasture opened, the structure became lower. In one broad section, there was barely any stone at all. Daniel pointed toward the missing section. They didn't finish it. Samuel set the level. The ground there was wider and flatter. Water entering that section would naturally spread. It didn't need the same protection. That was when the structure began making sense. Whoever built it hadn't been trying to create one continuous barrier. They had treated different parts of the pasture differently. More stone where water concentrated, less where it could spread. Samuel stood and looked toward the barn. A solid wall would have forced floodwater to accumulate behind it. Eventually water would go around one end or over the top. Either could create a new concentrated flow, possibly toward the barn. These stones were too low to trap much water. Water was supposed to cross them. Daniel frowned. So what's the point? Samuel walked back to the largest section. He pointed upstream. Fast water comes in here. then behind the rocks, hits this, then toward the sand deposits, and leaves some of what it was carrying. Daniel looked across the structure again. They were slowing it. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He wanted one more piece of evidence. They followed the stonework downhill. Near the lower end, the line widened. Then, it stopped, not because the rocks gradually disappeared. The ending was clean. Beyond it lay open ground. Daniel stepped into the gap. Here's your unfinished section. Samuel looked through it, straight downhill. Daniel carried the rod farther. First reading, lower, another, lower again. The ground beyond the gap formed a broad, shallow route toward the lowest corner of the property. Samuel stared at the numbers. The entire structure changed meaning. It wasn't designed to keep floodwater out. It interrupted the places where water became dangerous, then left somewhere for that water to go. Daniel looked toward the barn. Whoever built this knew the route. Samuel nodded, and suddenly a memory surfaced. Samuel was 16 again, sitting on an old tractor while his father stood in this same section of pasture. Samuel had wanted to plow through the low strip. His father had stopped him. Leave that strip alone. At the time, Samuel had thought the old man was being stubborn. Now he looked at the buried stones, at the sediment behind them, at the deliberate opening. His father had been gone 23 years. But for the first time, Samuel wondered whether the old man hadn't simply known the pasture flooded. Maybe he'd known exactly what to let the water do. Samuel stood at the opening in the old stonework long after Daniel left. He hadn't heard his father's voice in 23 years. Now he remembered exactly where the words had been spoken. Samuel had been 16. His father, Thomas Reed, had been standing beside the tractor, pointing toward the same low strip that now carried Samuel's blue flags. Samuel had wanted to plow straight through it. Depression made the field awkward. Thomas refused. Why? Because water needs somewhere to be. At 16, Samuel had thought that was nonsense. Water belonged in the creek. Pasture should be pasture. Soil should be level. Fields should be clean. Now Samuel looked from the buried stonework to the shallow route leading away from the barn. His father hadn't been protecting an ugly piece of ground. He had been preserving an exit. The next morning, Daniel found Samuel in the equipment barn going through an old wooden cabinet. What are you looking for? Something I should have remembered. Inside were rusted hinges, seed tags, fencing notebooks swollen by years of humidity. Samuel opened one. His father's handwriting filled the pages. Most entries were ordinary farm records. Calves, hay, fuel, repairs. Then Samuel stopped. A short entry followed 3 days of heavy rain. Reset rock below lower field. Clear grass. Daniel read it twice. Low run? Samuel looked toward the pasture. They went outside. Samuel didn't need to search for the location. The stonework had already shown them. Another entry appeared 2 years later. Creek high. Lower field washed. Open run before next rain. Not close it. Open it. Daniel looked at Samuel. Father was maintaining this. Samuel nodded. That mattered more than the memory. Memory could change over 23 years. These notes had been written when the work was still being done. Samuel turned several pages, then found another entry. Rock moved again. Put back wide. Don't raise. Daniel looked toward the old stones. Don't raise. Samuel stared at the words. Yesterday they'd discovered the structure had deliberately been built low. Now he knew that wasn't an accident of age. His father had wanted it that way. Wide, low, passable. Exact characteristics Samuel had reconstructed from the ground. Then another memory returned. After one summer storm, Samuel had watched his father move stones by hand. Samuel had asked why he didn't stack them higher so they wouldn't wash around. Thomas had answered, if the rock never moves, something else will. Samuel hadn't understood. Now he did. A structure strong enough to resist everything could simply transfer the force somewhere else. Into the bank, around the end, toward the barn. His father hadn't been trying to make immovable stonework. He had been choosing what he was willing to let move. Daniel looked across the fresh flood debris. So he already solved this. Samuel closed the notebook. No. Daniel frowned. He knew the root built the stones, kept the outlet open. He managed it. That distinction mattered. The creek changed. Trees fell. Sediment accumulated. Floods arrived at different heights. His father hadn't left behind a finished solution. He'd left behind a way of reading the land. Samuel walked to the fresh stones deposited by the latest flood. The first time he didn't see 20 acres of cleanup. He saw material lying beside the exact places the water had just identified as vulnerable. But copying his father's old structure stone for stone would be another mistake. The land had changed. Samuel needed the principle, not the pattern. Daniel pointed toward the loader. So now we move them. Samuel looked at the erosion cut, the breach, the broad section where water could spread. Then the old opening his father had repeatedly kept clear. Yes, where? Samuel pulled a handful of flags from his pocket. Where the water told us. For 23 years, Samuel had remembered his father's refusal to straighten that pasture as stubbornness. Now he understood. His father hadn't been trying to control where the water came from. He had been protecting where it was allowed to go. By Saturday morning, loader was finally moving stone. but none of it was leaving Samuel's pasture. Daniel operated the tractor while Samuel stood beside the flood path, directing him one bucket at a time. Here? Samuel shook his head. 10 feet upstream. Daniel backed up. Why 10 feet? Because that's where the water started cutting. That distinction mattered. Samuel wasn't building where the damage looked worst. He was building where the water had gained enough energy to cause the damage. They started at the narrow erosion cut. During the flood, a broad sheet of water had been squeezed between two slightly higher sections of ground. The flow became narrower, faster, and strong enough to strip away the topsoil. Samuel placed the largest stones first. But not in a wall. Daniel lowered one boulder. Another went several feet away, then another. From above, the arrangement looked almost careless. Daniel climbed down. You're leaving gaps, on purpose. Water's going straight through. Some of it should. Samuel crouched and drew a line in the mud. If I stop all of it here, the water stacks up behind the rock. He drew another line around the side. Then it looks for another way. And that's bad. Depends where it finds one. Samuel pointed toward the barn. A solid barrier could create a new channel around either end. Worse, concentrated overflow could cut deeper than the original flood. Samuel didn't want to trap the water. He wanted to take energy out of it. The stones would roughen the path, break the fastest current, spread part of the flow sideways, protect exposed soil from taking the full force directly. Daniel looked at the loose arrangement. So we're not building a dam. No, what are we building? Samuel thought for a moment. Time. Daniel laughed. Samuel didn't. Fast water could move soil, gravel, even large stone. Slow the same water enough and it began dropping what it carried. Samuel had already seen proof across the pasture. The flood itself had sorted boulders, gravel, sand, and mud according to where its energy changed. Now he wanted to make that loss of energy happen earlier. They moved to the creek breach. Samuel surprised Daniel again. He didn't fill it completely. Instead, he stabilized the most vulnerable edge with large rock while leaving the main creek channel unobstructed. Then they moved downstream. At another erosion point, Samuel used medium stone. At a wider section, almost none. Daniel pointed at the untouched ground. We've got plenty left. That's not a reason to use it. By afternoon, they had moved several tons. The pasture still looked rough. Large stones remained everywhere, but the pattern was beginning to make sense. The heaviest material protected the places that had taken the hardest hit. Smaller rock armored exposed soil, and every placement respected the low root Samuel's father had once left open. Then Daniel noticed something. You haven't touched that pile. The center of the pasture sat one of the largest concentrations deposited by the flood. Samuel nodded. I'm leaving it. Why? Samuel walked over. Behind the stones, fresh sediment had accumulated. Grass was flattened. The soil beneath hadn't been cut nearly as deeply as the ground beside it. The flood had already tested this arrangement. Not intentionally, not perfectly, but the stones had absorbed and disrupted enough flow to protect the soil immediately downstream. Samuel pointed. Why spend diesel on doing something that's already doing the job? Daniel looked around. That was when the title finally made sense to him. Samuel hadn't refused to haul the stone away because the stone was valuable. He hadn't discovered rare rock. He wasn't saving money on some future construction project. The value was where the flood had delivered it. Moving every stone off the pasture would erase both the evidence and some of the protection the flood had accidentally created. Daniel leaned against the loader. So the flood brought you the solution? Samuel shook his head. No, he pointed toward the orange and yellow flags. It brought me information, then toward the stones and material. Those were not the same thing. Without understanding the flood path, the rocks were just thousands of pounds of debris. Without the rocks, Samuel would have needed to bring material onto the property to protect the vulnerable areas. The storm had delivered both, but only if he resisted the urge to clean everything first. By sunset, Daniel looked toward the barn. So we're protected now? Samuel followed his gaze. After all this, we changed how water meets a few places. Isn't that protection part of it? Samuel walked toward the low opening in the old stone structure. The most dangerous mistake would be thinking the job ended with slowing the water, because every gallon that entered the pasture still had to leave. If Samuel didn't decide where that could happen safely, the next flood would decide for him. By Monday afternoon, word had spread. Samuel Reed was building something in the pasture. From the county road, it looked like a rough line of stone running across the flood path. By lunchtime, 2 neighbors had stopped to look. One of them, Carl, stood beside Daniel and stared at the largest rock. You building a dam? No, Samuel said. Carl pointed toward the creek. Looks like one. Samuel kept working. Then you're looking at it wrong. Carl laughed. It happens when the next flood hits that. Water goes through. That stopped him. You want it to go through? Absolutely. Samuel walked toward the section they'd completed the day before. The stones weren't stacked vertically. They were spread low and wide. There were gaps. The center was deliberately lower than some of the surrounding ground. It looked unfinished. That was intentional. Samuel picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. Water comes down here. Drew a narrow line representing the flood path. If I build a solid wall across it, water doesn't disappear. He blocked the line with his boot. It rises. Then he drew 2 lines around either side. Eventually it finds another route. One line pointed toward the barn, the other toward the neighboring property. Carl stopped smiling. Samuel continued. And if enough water gets behind a barrier and that barrier fails, you don't get the same flood back. He erased the wall with his boot. You get stored water moving at once. That was exactly what Samuel did not want. The goal wasn't to hold a flood on his pasture. It was to make fast water slower before it reached the vulnerable ground. Daniel pointed toward the gaps. So these let pressure through. They let water through. Samuel corrected him deliberately. He wasn't pretending this was an engineered dam. It wasn't. It was a series of low stone protections built around what the land had already shown him. The narrow erosion cut the rocks disrupted concentrated flow. Near the damaged creek bank they protected exposed soil. Farther downhill, Samuel used less stone because he wanted the water to spread. Every section had a different job. Carl looked across the field. Why not just dig a ditch straight back to the creek? Samuel pointed toward the slope. Because water doesn't care that the ditch looks straight on a map. A poorly placed ditch could accelerate flow. It could deepen. Its outlet could erode. If it carried water toward the creek too quickly, while the creek was already full, it might accomplish nothing. Samuel wanted gravity working with him, not against him. Walked toward the old stone structure his father had left. Samuel had uncovered more of it. The most important part remained the gap at the lower end. Carl pointed. You're going to fill that? No, that's the biggest hole in the whole thing. That's why it stays. Samuel set the level again. Daniel carried the rod through the opening and farther downhill. Reading after reading confirmed what Samuel had suspected. Beyond the gap, the ground fell gradually toward the lowest corner of the property. Away from the barn, away from the equipment yard, away from the neighboring house. That was the exit. Not a ditch, not a pipe. A broad, low area where water could spread without being forced into one destructive stream. Samuel planted blue flags along it. Daniel looked back. Orange flags marked where the flood had carried its heaviest stone. Yellow marked where it had slowed. Blue now marked where Samuel wanted excess water to leave. The first time the entire plan could be seen at once. Enter. Slow. Spread. Carl studied the flags. So you're telling the water where to go? Samuel shook his head. You don't tell floodwater much. He pulled another blue flag from his pocket. You give it an easier choice. That was the principle his father's buried stone line had revealed. Don't fight the entire flood. Protect the places that cannot afford the energy. Then preserve a route where excess water can leave with the least damage. Samuel walked toward the barn. From there, the stonework looked surprisingly small. No high wall, no massive earth berm, nothing that appeared capable of controlling thousands of gallons of water. Daniel joined him. You think it's enough? Samuel looked toward the creek. I think we understand more than we did last week.
That wasn't my question.
No. Samuel studied the clouds gathering over the ridge. Because we haven't tested it. The first flood had shown them the route. The stones had shown them where the water carried the most power. The old structure had shown Samuel that someone before him had faced the same problem. But none of that proved his changes would work. Only another large flow of water could do that. And before it came, Samuel still had one critical job left. He had slowed the water. He had given it room to spread. Now he had to make absolutely certain it had somewhere safe to leave. Samuel spent more time on the exit than he had on the stone. Daniel didn't understand why. The creek breach looked dramatic. Boulders looked important. But Samuel was now standing in the lowest corner of the pasture with a level, a shovel, and a handful of blue flags. Daniel followed him downhill. We've already got the water slowed. That's only half the job. Samuel drove another flag into the ground. If it comes in, it has to get out. The old stone structure had taught him that. It crossed part of the flood path, disrupted the flow, then stopped before the lowest ground. At first Daniel had thought whoever built it had simply run out of rock. Samuel now believed the gap had been deliberate. He checked the elevation again. From the stonework, the land dropped gradually through a broad swale toward the far corner of the property. No buildings, no equipment yard, no neighbor's house directly below it. Just rough pasture and farther down a natural drainage area. That was where Samuel wanted excess water to go. But there was a problem. Layers of sediment had partially filled the swale. Grass grew thick through it. Near the bottom, an old fence crossed the drainage at an angle. Flood debris could catch there. Daniel pointed. So we dig it deeper? No. Why not? Deep makes fast. Samuel didn't want a narrow ditch. Ditch could concentrate water. Concentrated water gained velocity. Velocity caused erosion. He wanted the opposite. A wide, shallow route. Enough fall for gravity to carry water away. Enough width to keep it from becoming a cutting stream. They started by removing only the obvious obstructions, dead branches, old wire, a rotted fence post lying across the low point. Samuel left the ground largely intact. Where sediment had created a small hump, he shaved it down carefully. Daniel watched the tractor bucket skim only a few inches of soil. You could finish this in one pass, and make a channel. Isn't that what we want? We want an outlet. Samuel pointed toward the grass.
You want roots staying here.
That vegetation mattered. Stone could protect specific impact points, but across a broad flow path, living roots helped hold soil together. Samuel wasn't trying to replace the pasture with rock. He wanted stone where water carried destructive energy, and vegetation where the land needed to absorb and spread it. By afternoon, the blue flags formed a broad corridor. Daniel walked to the top and looked down. It barely looked engineered. That pleased Samuel. The safest path was already in the land. They were only reopening it, then Samuel found a problem. At the far end of the swale, the ground narrowed before dropping toward the natural drainage. A previous owner had dumped soil there years ago, from cleaning a pond, maybe from digging foundations. Whatever the reason, the pile formed a low berm across part of the outlet. Samuel climbed onto it. Daniel followed. If the water reaches here, it backs up toward the barn, eventually. That changed the day's work. Samuel removed enough of the old fill to restore the natural low point. Not a trench, a broad notch. Then he armored the most vulnerable section with some of the smaller floodstone. Daniel looked at the rocks. So now we're finally hauling them away. Samuel smiled. About 300 yards. That was as far as they needed to travel. The flood had delivered material across the pasture. Samuel was simply redistributing part of it to the places where the next flood would test the land hardest. When they finished, Samuel walked the entire route. Creek breach, large stone, narrow erosion section, old structure, open gap, broad swale, armored outlet. Nothing was designed to stop all the water. Every part had one job: the soil, let it leave. Daniel stood beside him at sunset. So if another flood comes, it follows the blue flags. Samuel shook his head. Maybe, the flags are for us. He looked uphill. Water follows elevation. That was why Samuel refused to claim they'd solved anything. They had interpreted one flood, used old evidence, adjusted the ground. But water would make the final judgment. Over the next several days, Samuel seeded the bare soil around the repaired areas. He spread straw over the most vulnerable sections. Then he fenced cattle away from the new work. Daniel looked at the pasture. After all that labor, it still wasn't pretty. Stone remained visible. Orange, yellow, and blue flags crossed the field. Bare soil showed where erosion had cut through the grass. You going to clean the rest up now? Samuel looked at the remaining rock. Some finally, but not until the grass takes. Daniel sighed. Samuel didn't care what the pasture looked like from the road. He cared what happened when water came over the creek bank again. The first flood had left them tons of stone. Now Samuel had left the next flood something else, a way through, because he had learned the difference between controlling water and trapping it. You couldn't guarantee where floodwater entered. You couldn't make it disappear, but you could protect the places where it accelerated, and leave it somewhere safer to go. 3 weeks after the work began, Daniel stood at the gate and shook his head. If I didn't know what we'd done, I'd think we made it worse. Samuel looked across the pasture. Daniel wasn't wrong. Before the flood, the field had been green and nearly continuous. Now stone interrupted it everywhere. Large boulders remained near the old flood entrance. Lower sections were armored with smaller rock. Fresh straw covered bare soil. Blue flags still marked the overflow route. Orange flags marked where the first flood had carried its heaviest material. And a temporary fence kept cattle away from nearly a quarter of the pasture. From the road, it looked unfinished. Samuel preferred that to looking finished for the wrong reason. Daniel pointed toward a patch of exposed soil. We could grade that smooth. No seed would come up better. Maybe, then why leave it? Samuel walked toward the patch. The flood had stripped away several inches of topsoil there. But the shallow depression was also part of the route that allowed water to spread before reaching the outlet. Flattening it wasn't automatically an improvement. Samuel put his boot in the lowest section. You keep seeing rough ground. Do you see? Elevation several inches. That was all, but several inches had already determined which parts of the pasture were destroyed and which remained untouched. Samuel wasn't going to erase those differences simply because a smooth field looked better. They walked toward the stonework. Grass was beginning to emerge around the edges, thin, uneven, but alive. Samuel pulled one of the temporary fence posts to make sure it was still firm. Daniel looked toward the cattle waiting in the upper pasture. How long before they come back? The roots can handle them. You losing grazing. For now, that was another cost nobody saw from the road. Samuel had lost usable pasture, spent diesel, bought seed, repaired fencing, spent days moving rock that everyone had originally offered to haul away, and there was still no proof any of it would work. Daniel looked toward the barn. You could have just built a berm around that. Could have. Probably would have been faster. Probably. Maybe? Daniel waited. Samuel didn't defend himself. A berm around the barn might protect the building from shallow water. It might also redirect flow toward the equipment yard, or concentrate water along one side, or fail if overtopped. Samuel wasn't interested in protecting one structure while ignoring what the water did everywhere else. He wanted the pasture itself to handle the flow better. That required leaving parts of it looking like water belonged there. Near the old stone lines, Samuel stopped. The buried structure his father had left was visible again. Daniel had suggested rebuilding it taller. Samuel refused. Instead, he'd repaired only the sections that had collapsed enough to concentrate flow. The original low profile remained. Most importantly, the opening remained. Daniel stared at it. Still bothers me, the gap. Looks like we forgot to finish. Samuel smiled. That's why I like it. The unfinished-looking part was the part that might save everything else. By late afternoon, Samuel removed several orange flags. He no longer needed them. The stones themselves marked the high-energy path. The blue flags stayed, so did the temporary fencing. Daniel drove the loader back toward the barn. Before leaving, he stopped beside Samuel. You know what Carl said? No, said the field looked better before we started. Samuel looked across the rough pasture. He's right. Daniel laughed. You admit it? Of course. Samuel picked up a shovel.
I wasn't trying to make it look better.
That was the mistake people often made after a flood. Restore the appearance, remove the debris, fill every cut, straighten every irregularity, return the land to what it looked like before the water arrived. But Samuel had learned something from the stones. The pasture before the flood had hidden the problem beautifully. Grass had concealed the old drainage route. Soil had buried his father's stonework. Years without a major flood had made vulnerable ground look safe. Samuel didn't want that illusion back. He wanted the next storm to find a pasture prepared to get wet. That evening he stood at the gate alone. The field was rough. Stone remained exposed. One section couldn't be grazed. Work would take months to disappear beneath vegetation, maybe years. Then Samuel heard thunder, far beyond the ridge. Not close enough to matter yet. He looked west. Dark clouds were building. The forecast had mentioned rain. Now the sky suggested more than that. Samuel looked across the pasture one last time. For weeks everyone had judged the work while it was dry. That judgment meant nothing. The pasture hadn't been rebuilt for sunshine. It had been rebuilt for water, and sooner than Samuel expected, water was coming. The rain started before midnight. By 4 in the morning, Samuel was awake, not because of the thunder, because he could hear the creak from the house. Normally, it was little more than background noise. Now it was a continuous low roar. Samuel pulled on his boots. By the time Daniel's headlights appeared at the gate, rain was still falling hard. Daniel climbed out wearing a rain jacket. You've seen the creek? Not yet. They walked toward the pasture. Samuel carried a flashlight, but he didn't go near the bank. There was nothing to inspect there safely in the dark. They stopped on higher ground. The pasture below them was already taking water. Daniel aimed his light toward the orange flags. It's over. Samuel watched. The creek had left its channel again. Not exactly where it had during the first flood, but close enough. Water entered the pasture in a broad brown sheet. For several seconds Daniel said nothing. Then the beam found the first stone section. Water was already passing through it. You said those were supposed to slow it. They are. They're underwater. They're supposed to get wet. Daniel looked at him. This was the part Samuel had been waiting for. Anyone could admire stonework during dry weather. Now the water would tell them whether they'd understood the land correctly. The flow reached the first large rocks. It didn't stop. Samuel had never wanted it to. Water divided around the irregular surfaces. Some passed through the gaps, some spread sideways. Small standing waves formed behind several boulders. The current was still powerful, but it was no longer moving as one narrow, uninterrupted sheet. Daniel watched debris hit the stones. Grass, a small branch. Most passed through or around, some caught temporarily, then broke free. It's working. Samuel didn't answer. Too early. The first stone section had never been the part he feared most. He looked farther downstream. The narrow erosion cut was next. During the previous flood, water had concentrated there and stripped the topsoil away. Now stone protected the most vulnerable surface. Water reached it. Daniel moved closer. Stay here. They watched from stable ground. The flow narrowed, accelerated, hit the armored section. For several seconds the water turned turbulent. Daniel shouted over the rain. That looks worse. Samuel kept watching. Turbulence wasn't automatically failure. The question was what happened after the water lost that concentrated energy. Beyond the rocks the flow widened. Its surface became less violent. The grass downstream bent flat. But the soil beneath it wasn't immediately disappearing. Samuel looked toward the barn. Still dry, then the rain intensified. Within 20 minutes the water level across the pasture rose several inches. Daniel's confidence disappeared. Samuel, I see it. Water was reaching farther than it had during their smaller tests. The stonework had slowed parts of the flow, but it couldn't eliminate volume. More water was entering than before. Now the system would face the part Samuel considered most important, the outlet. He looked toward the blue flags. At first nothing. Then a thin sheet of water entered the broad swale. Daniel pointed. There, the flow moved downhill. Not fast, not yet. It spread across the grass exactly as Samuel had hoped. 20 feet wide, then 30. The shallow route filled gradually. Water reached the old gap in the stone structure and passed through. Daniel stared. The opening he'd wanted Samuel to close was now carrying water away from the barn. Samuel followed the flow with his eyes through the gap, across the swale toward the armored outlet. Then something changed. Water began pooling. Samuel saw it immediately. The level near the old stone line rose instead of continuing to fall. Daniel saw it too. Why is it backing up? Samuel aimed his flashlight downhill. Debris, a mass of branches and grass had collected at the old fence line near the outlet. Not enough to stop the water completely, enough to restrict it. The pasture began storing water. Daniel looked at Samuel. We need to clear it. No, we can reach it. In this water? Samuel shook his head. Nothing in the pasture was worth walking into moving floodwater at night. They would watch from high ground. If the outlet cleared itself, good. If it didn't, they would learn where the design had failed. The water continued rising. 10 minutes, then 15. Moved several yards closer to the barn. Daniel said nothing now. Samuel watched the outlet. A branch shifted, stopped, shifted again. Then the debris mass rotated. The current caught one end. Half the blockage tore loose. Water surged through the opening, not explosively. Fast enough for both men to see the level upstream begin falling. Daniel exhaled. The outlet was moving water again. By dawn, the rain had weakened. The creek was still high. The pasture was covered in water, but the barn remained dry. Daniel smiled. You did it. Samuel looked across the flooded field. No, Daniel's smile faded. We won't know until the water leaves. A structure could survive the peak and still fail underneath. Stone could move, soil could scour, the outlet could cut deeper. What looked successful from 50 yards away might hide damage beneath brown water. Samuel waited until daylight and safer conditions before approaching anything, because the second storm wasn't finished testing his work. The water had entered where expected. It had slowed, it had spread, and it had found the exit. Now Samuel needed to discover what it had taken with it. Samuel waited until the creek dropped before entering the pasture. Daniel wanted to go sooner. Samuel wouldn't let him. Brown water hid holes, unstable banks, displaced stone and wire. There was nothing they needed to learn badly enough to walk into moving floodwater. By late morning, the water had retreated from most of the upper field. Samuel entered on foot, with flags and a notebook. Daniel followed. Looks like it worked. Samuel stopped. Don't decide yet. He walked directly to the first stone section. Several rocks had meal immediately. That's bad. How far? One large stone had shifted perhaps 8 inches. 2 smaller pieces had rolled downstream. Samuel marked them with red flags, then he examined the soil behind them. Still there, that mattered more. The stones hadn't been placed because they could never move. They had been placed to prevent fast water from taking the pasture with it. Samuel pushed his boot against the protected ground. Firm. Then he stepped outside the armored area. A fresh groove had been cut through the mud, several inches deep. Daniel stared at the difference. So the rocks took it, some of it they moved downstream. At the narrow section, the evidence was stronger. The first flood had stripped away topsoil and exposed pale subsoil. This time, the current had hit stone first. Mud coated every rock. Grass lay flat, but the old erosion had not deepened significantly. Instead, fresh sand had accumulated in several pockets behind the stones. Samuel crouched and picked some up. Daniel smiled. That's good, it tells us the water slowed. The first flood had carried material away from this spot. The second had begun leaving some behind. That was the change Samuel wanted. If not dry ground, less destructive water. They continued toward the old stone line. Here, the pasture looked worse. Branches were tangled through the rocks. One section had partially collapsed. Daniel's smile disappeared. We lost that one. Samuel examined it. 3 stones had rolled downhill. The water had cut around one edge. A shallow channel now bypassed part of the structure. He planted several red flags. Needs work? You're rebuilding it? Not the same way, that was important. Samuel wasn't trying to prove his first design had been correct. The flood had just shown him where it wasn't. If water consistently wanted one path, simply replacing the stones exactly as before might recreate the same failure. He would adjust the section after studying the new cut. Then they reached the outlet. Samuel became quiet. The debris blockage from the night before had left clear evidence. Grass and branches were wrapped around the old fence. Mud had accumulated upstream. The water had backed up because the opening was too easy to obstruct. Daniel looked at the mess. So that nearly ruined everything. It showed us the weak point. Samuel marked the fence for removal. Anything capable of catching flood debris across the outlet had no business remaining there. But downstream of the blockage, something else had happened. The armored outlet had held. The smaller floodstones were still in place. No deep trench had formed. Water had spread into the natural drainage instead of cutting a new channel toward the barn. Samuel walked back uphill. He stopped at the closest point the flood had reached to the building. Mud ended well short of the foundation. The equipment barn was dry. Daniel looked at it. Now can I say it worked? Samuel looked across the pasture. Some stones moved. One section failed partially. The outlet had clogged. Several places needed adjustment. No, Daniel laughed. What would satisfy you? Samuel pointed toward the fresh erosion mark. If knowing where the water spent its energy. That was the real test. They walked the route again. At the creek entrance, energy had moved stone. At the first structure, the flow had been broken apart. At the narrow section, stone had protected the soil. Farther down, water had spread across vegetation. At the outlet, it had escaped toward lower ground. The pasture had still flooded. That wasn't failure. Samuel had never tried to prevent water from entering. He had tried to prevent concentrated water from turning the pasture into a channel aimed at the barn. Daniel looked toward the first red flag. So we make the rocks heavier? Not necessarily. More rocks, maybe in one place. Higher. Samuel shook his head. That's the last thing I'd assume. Higher could mean more water stored behind them. Samuel wanted to correct the specific failures the storm had revealed. Remove the debris-catching fence. Widen one vulnerable section. Replace displaced stone where the soil needed protection. Reseed areas where vegetation had taken the flow successfully. Nothing more. Daniel looked across the pasture. The second storm hadn't proven Samuel could control a flood. It had proven something more useful. He only needed to keep the flood from concentrating its power in the places that couldn't survive it. Samuel bent down beside one of the displaced stones. The upstream face had been scrubbed clean. Behind it sat a fresh deposit of sand. He ran his hand across both. During the first storm, everyone had looked at tons of stone and seen damage that needed to be removed. Now the evidence was lying directly beneath their boots. The stones had moved. The pasture had flooded. Parts of Samuel's work had even failed. But the soil that had disappeared during the first flood was still there, and the barn behind it was dry. A week after the second storm, most of the pasture was green again, not beautiful, not finished, but green. Samuel and Daniel walked the flood route one more time. The orange flags were gone. Most of the yellow ones too. Only the red markers remained where the second storm had exposed weaknesses. The first was beside the old fence at the outlet. Samuel had already removed it. No wire, no posts. Nothing left across the low ground to catch branches when the creek rose again. Daniel looked toward the open swale. Should have taken that fence out years ago. Samuel shook his head. We didn't know it mattered years ago. That was the lesson he'd been careful not to forget. After the first flood, it had been easy to look backward and make every clue seem obvious. It wasn't. Before the water exposed the root, the fence was just a fence. The shallow depression was just uneven pasture. His father's buried stonework was just rock beneath grass, and the tons of fresh stone had looked like nothing but damage. They continued uphill. The section that had partially failed, Samuel had not rebuilt it exactly as before. The flood had cut around one end, so Samuel widened the protected area there instead of making it taller. The lowest section remained low. Water still had permission to pass. Daniel kicked one of the replacement stones. Still feels wrong building something you expect water to go over. Samuel looked at him. That's because you keep thinking we're building a wall. They weren't. Walls were judged by whether water crossed them. Samuel judged his work by what the water did after it crossed. Did it remain concentrated? Did it dig? Did it accelerate toward the barn? Or did it spread, slow, and leave its sediment behind? That was the measurement. He reached the narrow erosion cut. Fresh grass was beginning to emerge between the stones. Samuel crouched. After the first flood, this section had lost topsoil. After the second, sand had accumulated behind the rock. The difference was small enough that someone driving past would never notice. Samuel noticed. Daniel did now too. The field still flooded. Yep, stones moved. Some. The outlet clogged for a while. And you're calling that successful? Samuel stood. No, Daniel waited. I'm calling it useful. A successful system wasn't one that never changed. Samuel didn't trust anything on a farm that claimed to be finished. Soil moved. Creeks changed. Trees fell. Roots grew. Floods arrived at different heights and speeds. The second storm hadn't given Samuel a certificate saying he'd solved the problem. It had given him another set of observations. That was better. They reached the center of the pasture. Daniel stopped. Months earlier, this was where he had wanted to bring the loader first. A broad concentration of floodstone still remained. Not exactly where the first storm had left every piece. Samuel had repositioned some, removed a few from grazing areas, used others downstream. Most had never left the farm. Grass now grew between. Daniel looked toward the road. Remember when Carl said we should haul all this out? Samuel smiled. He wasn't wrong. Daniel frowned. You spent 2 months proving he was. No. Samuel picked up a fist-sized stone. If the only thing we wanted was clean pasture, hauling it away made perfect sense. He dropped it. But clean pasture wasn't the problem. That was the difference. The first morning after the flood, everyone had looked at the result. Samuel had looked for the process. Why were the largest stones here? Why did gravel begin there? Why was grass flattened in one direction? Why did erosion suddenly deepen at one narrow point? Why did an old stone line lie beneath a root nobody remembered as a watercourse? Each answer had changed the next question. Until the stones stopped being debris, they became evidence. And once Samuel understood the evidence, some became material. Daniel looked toward the equipment barn, still dry, then toward the creek. So the flood gave you the solution. Samuel shook his head. That was too simple. The flood had destroyed fence, removed soil, damaged pasture, nearly sent water toward the barn. Nothing about that was a gift. It showed me the problem. Daniel looked down at the stones. And these? Samuel followed his eyes. The stones gave me something to answer with. They walked toward the gate. Behind them, the pasture still carried scars from both storms. Samuel hadn't erased them. Some scars were useful. They showed where the land had been tested, where repairs needed watching, where water would probably return. At the gate, Daniel turned for one last look. I think the next flood follows the same path. Samuel opened the latch, close enough to make me pay attention. And if it doesn't, Samuel looked toward the creek. Then we learn again. That was all farming had ever been. Not defeating weather, not controlling every gallon of water. Watching, remembering, changing what needed changing, and resisting the urge to erase evidence before understanding what it meant. The first morning, tons of stone had covered Samuel Reed's pasture. Everyone asked how quickly they could haul it away. Samuel had asked them to leave it exactly where the flood had put it. Not because the stones were valuable, not because he knew the answer, but because before he moved the damage, he wanted to understand what had caused it.